Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge. And today it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I talk about a comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And so this week, we're going to be talking about Superman once again. We're doing a series of videos on Superman. The first video we did on Superman was the Golden Age Superman. And today we're going to be talking about Superman in the 50s. So we're moving into the Silver Age Superman. I brought up this book so I have something to flash around. This book is Superman in the 50s, a great anthology that DC Comics printed. It's nice to actually get a little wee bit of 1950s Superman from DC Comics. And this is a good book. This is the second edition. There was a first edition of this book that wasn't as large. It was a shorter book, but they packed some more stories in here. So this is even better than that one was. And this gives you a pretty well-rounded view of Superman in the 1950s. So this is a good book to have. I'm going to be talking more generally about Superman in the 1950s, particularly the late 50s, when we're moving into the Silver Age of Superman. And Superman was huge in the 50s, actually, but he was huge mostly because of a television show, The Adventures of Superman. Which I enjoyed very, very much when I was a little kid. I watched Superman all the time. I think it was on every day. I feel like I watched Adventures of Superman every day for a while when I was a kid. It had a pretty good influence on me. Adventures of Superman did, like it had on so many other kids who had watched it before me, and instilled in me my first great love of that character, Superman. Superman, the television show, lasted a good portion of the 50s. And while the Superman television show was on, the Superman comic book kind of mirrored the show in a way. And it was after the show ended in the late 50s that the Silver Age of Superman really began. Most of the 50s were kind of this transitionary period between the Golden Age Superman, the character as he was in the Golden Age, and slowly becoming the character that he became in the Silver Age. And they were different characters. The comic had a very different feel in the Silver Age. So it was an interesting transitionary period, but it was also kind of stagnant in a way. There is a little bit from the introduction that I'm going to read you from this book, because it's written by Mark Waid, who is a comic book writer who claims at least that he has read every single Superman story ever written. And that is a hard thing to believe, but if anyone could do it, it would be Mark Waid. He certainly knows more about Superman than anybody. So this introduction in this book is pretty valuable. So let me just read you this little bit about that transitionary period. The TV show, of course, had neither the budget nor the special effects technology for world-beating supervillains. Instead, most of its episodes centered around gangsters and thugs, thwarted either because of or in spite of the staff of the Daily Planet. Consequently, that soon became the default caliber of foe in the comics. Despite Lex Luthor showing up with alarming regularity, the vast majority of Superman's enemies during the 1950s were crime bosses and con men. Pure street-level threats. Hardly a job for Superman. By the late 1950s, then, Superman had fallen into a rut. His adventures had become surprisingly pedestrian to the point of seeming repetitive and recycled. Mort Weisinger was keenly aware of this. After production of the TV show wrapped in 1957, Weisinger was given full editorial reign over Superman and went to work eliminating any hint of stagnation. His first rule: interweave every few months some new element or concept to the Superman mythos. There had been some minor inroads before then. Jimmy Olsen had, in 1954, received his own ongoing title, which set up the Superman Signal Watch and the Daily Planet Flying Newsroom for future writers' use. And in 1955, Superboy encountered Red K, the first of the seemingly thousands of variant hues of kryptonite to come. But it was the 20th anniversary edition of Action Comics, number 241, June 1958, that truly kicked off a new age of Superman. That issue introduced us to the Fortress of Solitude and its many wonders, not including the bottle city of Kandor, which made its debut the very next month when Superman wrenched it from the vile clutches of the aforementioned Brainiac. Also in 1958, Lois Lane was granted a regular series of her own, and by decade's end, we had even met Kara Zor-El, the last daughter of Krypton, whose adventures as Supergirl opened up a whole new arena of villains, supporting characters, and Kryptonian myth. So it was at that tail end of the 50s, the last few years, that the Silver Age of Superman really started. The Silver Age had started a little bit before that with The Flash, when The Flash was rebooted and came back as a new Flash. That is the point most comic book historians agree was the beginning of the Silver Age. But, you know, the Silver Age really is just some made-up thing that we're talking about now. With all the characters, these changes that came at slightly different times. And for Superman, it came right around 1958. But as said, Superman was slowly changing before that. You see some of those changes in this book, although most of the stories in this book do happen in the latter half of the 1950s. The 1950s were interesting for Superman because the late 1950s, the early Silver Age, and into the 60s, we really do get a lot of elements in the Superman mythology, and that's what it was. Superman was developing his own mythology, all of these different characters and villains and things that we learn about Krypton and all kinds of stuff kind of built up this world around Superman. And Superman became a more interesting character because of it. Now, when I first started reading Superman was in the 1980s with the John Byrne run of Superman, where he completely trashed and demolished and got rid of most of those mythos that I'm talking about. Because at the time of the 1980s, it was all about being gritty and realistic. There is nothing gritty or realistic about the 1950s Superman. The big blue Boy Scout. In the 1950s, that was a good thing to be. In the 1980s, not so much. So, in the interest of realism and perhaps making a more compelling comic book, in the 1980s, a lot of the stuff from the 50s and the 60s was trashed. Supergirl died and then was erased out of continuity altogether, along with a bunch of the other stuff that were introduced during the Silver Age, because it wasn't judged gritty or realistic enough, I suppose, for that time in comic book history. And at the time, when I read it, when I first started reading Superman, I knew about those characters. I knew about Supergirl. I even knew about, Krypto, the Superdog, one of the greatest comic book characters ever, Krypto. I knew about that stuff. I knew about Superboy, of course, Superman when he was a boy. And I thought it was all stupid. But it's important to note that at that point, I had never read any of those stories featuring those characters. So it was just the idea of those things that I thought was dumb. And so I was like, yeah, get rid of all that stuff. I'm just interested in Superman like he was in the film, because I knew Superman mostly at that point from the television show and from the Christopher Reeves movie. And that was the Superman I was wanting to read about. And that's kind of what John Byrne gave us. And it wasn't until later that I started reading this stuff in the few places I could read it from. The first time I ever found anything from the 50s and the 60s to read was in The Greatest Superman Stories Ever Told, which had some of those stories in there. And then later, much later, when DC Comics started putting out the black and white line of Showcase Presents volumes, I got the Showcase Presents volumes of Superman. That is finally when I got to read all of this Silver Age stuff. There were 4 volumes of the Showcase Presents. It was all black and white, which is fine for me. But it was a low quality phone book size comic books. They have yet, and I'm going to lament this once again, they have yet to do a high quality omnibus volume or even high quality paperback volumes that will reprint that whole time of Superman. They really need to do that. But it was a revelation reading all of those original stories, because there is nothing realistic about Superman or his world in the 50s and 60s. It is pure craziness. But it shows this great depth of imagination. It was probably the most imaginative time in the Superman comic book was the Silver Age, because they would just put up stories about anything, you know. Any crazy idea they had, they would put it in a story one way or the other. Maybe if it was too crazy, it would just be an imaginary story, but they'd do it. But even the regular stories were pretty wild. And the important thing, though, there's 2 important things, aside from it just being so imaginative and wild and kind of crazy. One important thing is that crazy weirdness was balanced by this sense of tragedy that the Superman comic book had. The loss of Krypton and Superman's culture, his whole world, his people, everything, that really made a mark on the character of Superman. That was important. That was important to him as a character. His Kryptonian heritage was important to him. And he treasured every little bit that he could find out about his parents or his world. Any little bit he would learn about Krypton was important to him. And he carried around this sense of tragedy and the pain of the loss of his homeworld and his parents, which gave that comic book a depth to it, because that's realistic. I would assume most orphans or even people that have been adopted have feelings like that about the loss of their birth parents, the wondering where they came from. Superman very much had that in the comic book. Only his loss was so great because he literally lost everything. And so you had that sense of tragedy. And a lot of the stories, you learn a lot about Krypton in the 50s and his Kryptonian heritage, and these other survivors of Krypton would show up, of course. And yet, despite all that, Superman still was still alone, basically. There was a distance between him and any other kind of Kryptonian anybody he would run across. And so that was important. So as wild and crazy as the stories got, you always had that to balance it. Another thing that was important is that these stories were really well told as stories. The stories themselves were really cleverly done. These were skillfully done stories. So even when they seem nuts, like when Krypto the Superdog shows up and, and does some crazy things, it worked. You know, a lot of these stories worked because they worked on the level of the stories. The reality is heightened and strange, but it works because it's consistent. These elements in the stories were consistently done. And so while you're reading these stories, you believe it. And more importantly, you believe in the characters in the stories. Superman, which you might think would be this one-dimensional character, isn't. He isn't in these characters. He's the big blue Boy Scout, of course. But he seems like a real person because of these things that I'm talking about. I don't have my showcase volumes with me, but I do have this volume, so I can show you a couple things I find particularly great about the Superman comics. At this point in the Superman comics, most of the stories, the design of Superman was based based on an artist called Wayne Boring, and there was Al Plastino who did some stories. The classic Superman we know from Curt Swan, you get some of that in here. That mostly happens in the late 60s and into the 60s. The Curt Swan Superman that those of us who know classic Superman are familiar with. A lot of the stuff in here is from Plastino and Boring. Boring, I don't think, lives up to his name. I think he was pretty good. And there's some pretty good stuff in here. You've got some early 50s stuff in here. Let me see. You've got Superman's big brother show up. That was a great story. It's not really Superman's big brother. You've got one of the greatest stories, well, a couple of the greatest stories. Let me see if I can get to this one. If this is the one I'm thinking of. Yeah. You've got the first Superman of Krypton. We're getting some of those Kryptonian mythos that I was talking about, where Superman learns more about his heritage. He always gets these glimpses of his world of Krypton, which is always very fascinating. Another great highlight is the introduction of, like I said, Krypto, the super dog. He's the super dog of Krypton, Krypto, who showed up in the Superboy comics. I love Krypto. Krypto is great. Krypto is such a great character that, of course, he had to return to the Superman comics eventually. He was gone for decades, I think. When did he return? Did he return in the 90s or the early 2000s? I don't remember. But the super dog came back. Krypto has returned, and now he's in the Superman comics once again, as he should. As he should. But this was a great story. Any of us who love dogs, of course, love Krypto. And Krypto, this is a pretty good story. But Krypto, of course, made many return appearances. We've got this story, The Return of Superman's Lost Parents. His adoptive parents, which had a tremendous influence on Superman. Ma and Pa Kent instilled in him his values, Superman. And so they were a big part of him becoming Superman. But again, there was tragedy. And so this story focuses on some of that tragedy. The tragedy of the loss of his adopted parents. And then we have Supergirl showing up. The female version of Superman. Supergirl, who has become a pretty popular character. She's had that TV show for a long time. I guess that's over now. But she had that show. I mean, it was dumb. Because it was a CW show, and those shows all had the same stupid things going on in them. But, popular character Supergirl. And we don't really get enough of her in the comics. Even now, I think her comic book has been canceled. DC's so dumb. Anyway, we've got Titano. Titano was a great story from the 50s. Let's see, what else do we have in here? My favorite... I'm going to go right to my favorite story from the 1950s. This is my favorite Superman story from the 1950s, And it might be my favorite Superman story. This is the Super Duel in Space, where we have a cover by Kurt Swan, I believe. And this is when he first meets Brainiac. This is such a well done story. It's so great. It's so 1950s. And this, of course, is the story where he finds the bottled city of Kandor. A whole city of Kryptonians, but they're all teensy tiny. Because Brainiac got him before Krypton blew up, and he's got him held captive. Superman rescues the bottled city, but he can't make him big, you know. So he's keeping the bottled city of Kandor in his fortress of solitude. This book is full of stuff like that. If you could find the old showcase volumes, they're great. There is some Silver Age stuff on digital, but not enough. And of course, they haven't reprinted, like I said, a Silver Age omnibus yet. I'm hoping they do before I'm dead. Print the Silver Age omnibus before I'm dead, DC Comics. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Superman. I've probably gone on at length. As I always do in these comic book videos, these things go on forever. Sorry, guys. I appreciate the few of you who watch Epic Comic Book Wednesdays. Be sure to tune in to Steve Donoghue, because his episode's going to be dynamite, because he loves Superman too. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.